In the early weeks of May 1945, as the last artillery fire faded from the hills of Central Europe, Germany entered a silence that felt almost unnatural. It was not peace in the celebratory sense that would later appear in photographs and commemorative speeches. It was a quieter, heavier stillness, one born of exhaustion, disbelief, and the sudden absence of direction. The war had not ended with a single sound, but with many small ones. Boots no longer marching, sirens no longer crying, radios falling silent between broadcasts. For a nation raised on command and obedience, the quiet itself was disorienting. In towns scattered across Bavaria, Hesse, and the Rhineland, flags were taken down or torn apart. Some were buried. Others were burned hastily behind houses before occupying forces arrived. Windows were opened for the first time in months without fear of glass shattering from nearby explosions. Yet inside those homes, particularly in the rooms where children slept, the war lingered. Its imprint remained on bodies that had learned to move quickly at the sound of engines, on minds trained to watch adults for cues of danger. Among those left behind were boys, thousands of them, who had worn uniforms before they were old enough to shave. Some had been members of the Hitler Youth in its final, desperate mobilization. Others had been pressed into auxiliary units, runners, lookouts, helpers and flak batteries. They had been taught songs, slogans, and gestures of loyalty long before they understood their meaning. Now, stripped of command and certainty, they stood in doorways and fields, unsure what shape their lives would take in a world where the authority they had been taught to revere had vanished almost overnight. The arrival of American troops was swift and, to many, bewildering. They came in long convoys, their vehicles humming steadily through ruined streets. Their uniforms were unfamiliar, cleaner, looser, less severe. Their voices carried a confidence that seemed untouched by defeat or hunger. They moved with the assurance of men who expected the world to make room for them. To the German civilians watching from behind curtains or broken fences, the Americans appeared not merely as victors, but as representatives of an entirely different order of life. Officially, the occupation was defined by policy and protocol. There were rules about fraternization, about curfews and rationing, about the dismantling of institutions that had shaped the previous regime. Reports were written, directives issued, zones demarcated. But beneath this administrative surface, another reality unfolded, one that rarely entered official documents. Children, particularly boys who had spent their adolescence under militarized discipline, found themselves suddenly without a framework. Their former instructors were gone or imprisoned. Their slogans were discredited overnight. Their sense of purpose had dissolved into uncertainty. In this vacuum, the presence of American soldiers took on an unexpected weight. At first there was fear. Stories circulated about enemy brutality, about punishment, about revenge. Some boys hid when the troops approached. Others watched silently from doorways, memorizing details. The way the soldiers laughed, the way they smoked, the strange music that drifted from portable radios. Gradually, fear gave way to curiosity. Curiosity, in turn, softened into something more complicated. The Americans brought food, real food, not the thin substitutes of the final war years. Chocolate bars, canned meat, white bread. These items carried a symbolic power that exceeded their nutritional value. They represented stability, abundance, and a world beyond deprivation. For children who had learned to measure days by hunger, the simple act of being fed without obligation was transformative. Yet food was only the beginning. The soldiers spoke to the children, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with gestures and smiles when language failed. They asked names. They asked ages. They attempted jokes. In these exchanges, something subtle shifted. The men in uniform were no longer abstract enemies. They became individuals with faces, habits, and moods. The children, in turn, ceased to be an anonymous population and became recognizable, even familiar. It was in these small, ordinary interactions that an unsettling dynamic began to form. Authority, once rigid and impersonal, softened. Obedience, once demanded, was now coaxed. The children found themselves responding not to orders but to approval. A nod, a smile, a pat on the shoulder, these gestures carried a weight disproportionate to their simplicity. 4 boys raised in a system that had equated obedience with virtue and sacrifice with honor, this shift was disorienting. They had been taught that discipline was love, that loyalty was life. Now they encountered a different kind of attention, one that did not require slogans or salutes. The confusion this produced was profound, though rarely articulated. The older civilians noticed it too. Mothers watched their sons gravitate toward the American camps, returning with stories and small gifts. Some felt relief, others felt unease. The authority of parents, already weakened by defeat and deprivation, was further eroded by the presence of foreign soldiers who seemed, in the eyes of the children, to possess both power and generosity. No one spoke openly about what this meant. In public discourse, the focus remained on reconstruction, denazification, and recovery. In private, the emotional terrain was far more complex. Bonds were forming that did not fit easily into categories of enemy or ally, occupier or occupied. These relationships were not uniform. Some were brief and transactional. Others lingered, shaped by repeated contact and mutual dependence. A boy might be assigned to clean a barracks and end up staying to listen to stories told in halting German. Another might be taught how to play a game, how to throw a ball, how to laugh without restraint. Such moments were small, easily overlooked, yet they carried immense psychological weight. For the children, the Americans became figures of contradiction. They were soldiers who did not shout, victors who offered kindness, authority figures who asked rather than commanded. This contradiction unsettled the rigid moral framework the boys had inherited. It forced a re-evaluation not only of the war, but of the adults who had sent them into it. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it complete. Many children resisted it, clinging to familiar certainties even as those certainties crumbled. Others embraced the new reality with a hunger born of loss. What united them was a sense of standing at the edge of something undefined, a future that did not yet have a name. In the quiet hours of evening, when the noise of the day subsided, these boys lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds. Laughter drifting from barracks, engines idling in the distance, foreign words carried on the night air. The war had ended, but its echoes lingered inside them. They were no longer soldiers, but they were not yet anything else. It was in this uncertain space, between defeat and reconstruction, between childhood and something harder, that a profound and largely unspoken transformation began. The Americans were not meant to become fathers, nor the boys' sons. And yet, in the absence of everything familiar, something resembling that relationship began to take shape, quietly, without permission, in the ruins of a defeated nation. The meaning of this transformation would not be clear for years. It would resist simple explanation, existing instead as a collection of memories, contradictions, and unanswered questions. What did it mean to be cared for by those once named as enemies? What did loyalty mean when the world that defined it had collapsed? These questions lingered in the air of post-war Germany, unresolved and heavy, waiting for time to give them shape. The days began to settle into patterns that no one had planned but everyone came to recognize. Morning brought the same thin light through broken windows, the same measured footsteps of soldiers changing shifts, the same rustle of children stirring on straw pallets or borrowed mattresses. The war was officially over, yet the rhythm of occupation created its own order, one that neither resembled peace nor resembled conflict. It existed somewhere in between, shaped by necessity and improvisation. For the boys who had once worn uniforms of their own, the loss of structure was as unsettling as the violence that had preceded it. They had been trained to expect commands, to define themselves through obedience and rank. Now no one shouted their names during roll call. No one inspected their boots. The absence of discipline did not feel like freedom, it felt like standing on ground that might give way without warning. Many of them were housed in makeshift quarters, former schools, barns, requisitioned homes, where American units had established temporary bases. These spaces carried overlapping histories. A chalkboard might still display fragments of arithmetic lessons, while beneath it sat crates of ammunition or rations stamped with foreign markings. The boys moved through these rooms cautiously, aware that they were guests in a world not meant for them. Daily life revolved around simple tasks. They fetched water, swept floors, carried supplies. In return they were fed. The food itself became a kind of language. Canned meat, white bread, sugar, items once unimaginable, were offered without ceremony. At first, the boys accepted them with suspicion, glancing around as if waiting for a catch. Over time, hunger overrode hesitation. The body learned to trust before the mind did. The Americans observed this carefully. Some had children of their own back home. Others were scarcely older than the boys they now supervised. They struggled to define the boundaries of their role. Official orders warned against fraternization, yet daily proximity made detachment nearly impossible. A soldier might teach a boy to tie a knot properly or show him how to fix a loose hinge, acts so ordinary they barely registered as transgressions. But for the child they carried immense weight. Language was a barrier, but not an insurmountable one. Words were supplemented by gestures, by tone, by repetition. Over time, a shared vocabulary emerged, half English, half German, peppered with invented phrases that belonged to no one else. In this improvised communication, authority softened. Commands turned into requests. Correction became instruction. The boys began to observe the Americans with the same intensity once reserved for their former leaders. They noticed differences: the way these men laughed openly, the way they questioned orders, the way they spoke of home with longing rather than reverence. Some of the soldiers showed photographs of families, wives, children standing in front of houses that seemed impossibly intact. The images suggested a world where fathers returned home, where war was something that happened elsewhere. For boys who had grown up amid constant mobilization, this was both comforting and destabilizing. It introduced the idea that adulthood might not require hardness, that authority could coexist with warmth. Yet it also deepened a sense of loss. Their own fathers were absent, dead, imprisoned, or simply changed beyond recognition. In the presence of these foreign men, that absence became more pronounced. Not all interactions were gentle. There were moments of anger, of misunderstanding, of resentment on both sides. Some soldiers resented the boys' closeness, viewing it as an unwanted reminder of responsibility. Some boys reacted with defiance, testing boundaries, asserting a toughness learned too early. The dynamic shifted constantly, shaped by individual personalities and circumstances. Still, patterns emerged. Meals were shared. Stories were exchanged. Evenings grew quieter, more domestic. A boy might sit near a soldier cleaning his rifle, listening to the rhythmic click of metal, feeling a strange sense of safety in the predictability of the sound. Another might fall asleep to the murmur of English conversation, comforted by its steady cadence even without understanding the words. The transformation was gradual and uneven. There was no single moment when enemy became caretaker, or child became dependent. Instead, it happened through accumulation of small gestures, repeated kindnesses, shared routines. The boys learned to anticipate moods, to sense when a soldier was tired or troubled. The soldiers, in turn, learned the unspoken histories carried by the children, the losses they did not articulate, the fear that surfaced in dreams. Occasionally, official reminders intruded. Orders were issued restricting contact. Briefings warned of emotional entanglement. But such directives struggled to compete with the reality on the ground. The war had created a vacuum of authority, and in that vacuum human connection rushed in. Some boys began to adopt American mannerisms unconsciously. They picked up slang, mimicked gestures, even altered their posture. Their identities, once rigidly defined by ideology, became fluid. This change was not always welcomed by the surrounding community. Older civilians watched with unease as children gravitated toward the occupiers, fearing cultural erosion, moral compromise, or worse. Yet for the boys themselves, these relationships were often a lifeline. In a world stripped of certainty, the Americans represented stability, even if temporary. They provided not only food and protection but also attention, something many of the children had been denied during the chaos of war. There were moments of quiet intimacy that never made it into reports. A soldier teaching a boy to write his name in English letters. A shared cigarette, lit furtively behind a building. A hand placed briefly on a shoulder in reassurance. These acts were small, almost invisible, but they carried profound emotional weight. As weeks turned into months, the initial intensity of occupation began to fade. The routine settled. Some soldiers were reassigned. New faces arrived, unfamiliar and less connected. The boys felt these changes acutely. Attachments formed in haste now faced the inevitability of separation. Rumors circulated about transfers, about units moving on. Each departure carried a quiet sense of loss. Goodbyes were rarely formal. More often they were marked by an extra ration slipped into a pocket, a lingering handshake, a look held a moment too long. Words were scarce. What needed to be said felt too heavy for language. The boys learned, perhaps for the first time, that attachment could be temporary yet meaningful. That care did not guarantee permanence. This understanding settled into them slowly, shaping their expectations of the world to come. In the broader landscape, reconstruction advanced. Buildings were repaired, schools reopened, governments reorganized. The official narrative moved forward toward recovery and renewal. But beneath this surface, the emotional imprint of those early months remained. For the children who had lived through it, the Americans were never just occupiers. They were figures who had entered their lives at a moment of profound vulnerability and altered their understanding of authority, trust, and belonging. The experience did not resolve their past nor secure their future, but it reshaped the space in between. As time passed, the memories blurred, softened by distance and age. Yet certain sensations endured. The taste of unfamiliar food, the sound of boots on wooden floors, the feeling of being seen by someone who was supposed to be an enemy. These fragments endured not as history but as something closer to instinct. The war had taken much from these children, but in its aftermath, it had also left them with a complicated inheritance. A knowledge that care could come from unexpected places, and that identity was more fragile and more malleable than they had been taught to believe. This understanding did not bring peace. It brought ambiguity. And in that ambiguity, the boys carried forward, shaped by an experience that refused to fit neatly into the categories of victor and vanishing foe. Years later, when the landscape had been rebuilt and the outlines of the war softened by distance, the memories did not fade in neat lines. They returned instead in fragments, uninvited, uneven, persistent. A smell of boiled coffee. The weight of a borrowed jacket on narrow shoulders. A voice calling a name with an accent that no longer existed in the same way. For those who had been children in those months after the collapse, the past did not sit behind them. It moved quietly alongside them. Many of the men who had once been boys rarely spoke of that time in public. When they did, they avoided grand explanations. They did not frame their experiences as redemption or betrayal, nor as proof of triumph or moral awakening. What they remembered were moments that resisted classification, standing beside an American truck as snow fell, sharing a meal in silence, being looked at not as a symbol of a defeated nation but as a child whose hunger was visible and undeniable. As years passed, memory reshaped itself. Some details sharpened, others faded. The precise words spoken were forgotten, but the tone remained. The feeling of being seen, of being addressed as an individual rather than a role, lingered long after the names and faces blurred. In later life, when asked about those days, many struggled to explain why the presence of those soldiers had mattered so deeply. They spoke instead of atmosphere, of contrast, of a sudden loosening in a world that had been tightly bound by fear. The Americans, for their part, carried their own versions of remembrance. In letters and interviews decades later, some recalled the kids, with a tenderness that surprised even themselves. They spoke of the confusion they felt, how they had arrived trained for combat and found themselves acting as caretakers, teachers, substitutes for something missing. Few had anticipated how difficult it would be to leave, how the bonds formed in that uncertain time would follow them home. Time, however, reshaped those memories as well. What had once felt immediate became distant, filtered through the lives that followed. Careers, families, other wars intervened. The intensity of that brief intersection faded into something quieter, more abstract. Yet even then, it never disappeared entirely. For some, it resurfaced unexpectedly, in the sight of a child standing alone, in the sound of a foreign language spoken softly, in the unease provoked by uniforms and authority. The children who had grown up in those months carried a particular kind of inheritance. They had learned early that power could be gentle, that enemies could show kindness, that allegiance was not always clear. This knowledge did not always make life easier. In some cases, it complicated their sense of belonging, leaving them uncertain of where they fit in a world that preferred clear divisions. In others, it fostered a skepticism toward simple narratives of good and evil. As Germany rebuilt itself, official histories emphasized reconstruction, economic recovery, and political renewal. The quieter stories, the ones that unfolded in kitchens, courtyards, and makeshift shelters, rarely found a place in public memory. They were too ambiguous, too personal, too resistant to tidy interpretation. Yet they persisted in private recollection, shaping how individuals understood authority, compassion, and loss. For some, the presence of the American soldiers became a reference point against which all later authority was measured. For others, it remained a source of unresolved emotion, a reminder of a time when the world had collapsed and reformed around them without their consent. The relationships forged in those months defied easy categorization. They were not familial, yet carried traces of parenthood. Not friendships, yet marked by intimacy. Not acts of rescue, yet undeniably formative. As the decades passed, reunions grew rarer. Names were forgotten. Letters went unanswered. Graves filled. What remained were impressions, half-formed memories that surfaced unexpectedly, often without explanation. A man might recall, without warning, the warmth of a hand on his shoulder, or the sound of laughter in a language he no longer spoke. These recollections arrived without context, fragments of a past that refused to remain buried. In the end, what endured was not a clear lesson but a lingering question. What does it mean to be shaped by those who were never meant to stay? How does one measure the influence of care offered in the aftermath of destruction, by those who themselves were passing through? The children of that moment grew into adults carrying an experience that defied simple moral framing. The war ended, borders shifted, and histories were written. Yet beneath the official record, another story persisted, one composed not of victories or defeats, but of human contact in a time of ruin. It was a story without heroes or villains, only individuals meeting under circumstances they did not choose. In quiet moments, long after the uniforms had been folded away and the camps dismantled, the memory of that encounter remained. Not as a tale of salvation or betrayal, but as an unresolved presence, an echo of a time when the lines between enemy and guardian blurred, and a generation learned too early how fragile and complicated belonging could be.